Hi there, working preachers. This is Karoline Lewis along with Matt Skinner and Rolf Jacobson. And here we are at Holy Week 2025. I can't believe we're here already.
We're taking a moment to say thank you for all of the hard work you've already done to prepare for Holy Week. We also want to encourage you as you write your final sermon or sermons for the days ahead.
We hope that you'll find inspiration from the resources posted on Working Preacher, whether it's this podcast, the mini text commentaries, or the videos and articles available for you and for others on workingpreacher.org and its YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram channels.
We are so grateful each and every year for the ways in which you so faithfully proclaim the mystery of the death and resurrection of Jesus. And we hope, working preachers, that you have a very blessed Holy Week. Welcome to Sermon Brainwave with me, Karoline Lewis.
And me, Matt Skinner.
And me, Rolf Jacobson.
The text for Passion Sunday, Palm Sunday, or Palm Sunday, Passion Sunday, not really quite sure which to put first, which is April 13, 2025, this year, are from Isaiah chapter 50, 4 through 9a. Our psalm is Psalm 31, 9 through 16. The second reading is Philippians 2, 5 through 11, and we have two gospel readings. The gospel reading for Passion Sunday, Luke 22, 14 through 23, 56, or if you are doing the procession of the palms, Luke 19, 28 through 40. Woo, that was a lot of reading of the text.
And there's no palms in Luke, so it's not really the procession of the palms.
Exactly. There are no palms. So, and in what gospel only are there palms?
I think it's the fourth one.
That's correct.
I think you only refer to it as this gospel.
The gospel.
No, it's always in this gospel.
In this gospel.
Yeah.
Yeah, so preachers have a choice. We talk about this every year, often thinking about the ways in which they want this particular Sunday to be marked. With the Passion Sunday moving into Holy Week or Palms, and then leaving the Holy Week or Passion Gospel for Friday. So that also becomes a homiletical question, and they have to decide that. But nonetheless, we'll try to offer opinions on both. Yes, gentlemen?
Absolutely, we will.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's so many choices, right? And people know how to do this unless you're very relatively new in pastoral leadership or preaching, but I think anything that helps connect Palm Sunday to the Passion is really helpful in proclamation. I know some churches begin with the procession, read this text, and then by the time you've gotten to the scripture reading, or at least the end of the service for sure, you've read part of the Passion narrative. But something that helps, I think, juxtapose the drama of the entry and the talk of kingship, and ends with Jesus dying is important, right? One of those without the other gives a deficient view of what's going on in these parts of the Gospels, this final stage in Jesus' life.
Yeah, and especially when we've been going through Luke and what we've been, talking about so far in our discussions around Luke, that he sets his sights to Jerusalem so far early, right, in the gospel. And so not to include the entry into Jerusalem would be odd, in particular for Luke. And so I think that's one thing that the preacher might want to consider is that, okay, now we're finally here. What difference does that make? Is there a way to look back and say how that trajectory of or obedience of Jesus that we've been talking about now for many, many weeks, now we've arrived at that place.
It's a really good point. And it makes me say something that I'm probably going to regret, because this is the worst Sunday of the year to try to add verses. But in Luke, immediately after he enters the city, you get verses 41 through 44, where he laments over the city, weeps over the city, which helps set up the way in which Jerusalem's going to function in the Passion narrative.
And has already functioned in many ways, right, for the Gospel of Luke.
That's what I was going to say. I don't think that's really a homiletical choice about which text you read, that because most congregations have a tradition.
Yeah.
And it's really wise for pastoral leaders to stay within whatever the tradition is locally. Conform yourself to the local tradition. Don't bring in all of your own hobby horses, or in this case, hobby donkeys.
Hobby donkeys.
But that's such a bad joke.
That was funny.
Oh, thank you. But the Palm Sunday reading starts after he had said this. He went on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. It is interesting to me that it emphasizes he. So it's really emphasizing Jesus' isolation and loneliness in some way, I think, which really I think does get, I think Mary Shore writes about this in the commentary online. Maybe I got it from reading it and she didn't actually say it, but sort of the, especially compared to Jesus and some of the, as she writes about comparing to some of the people who are kind of declared guilty as Jesus as being innocent.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Going back to what you said then, I'm actually in favor, if you're reading the Palm Sunday reading and not the whole Passion, go ahead and add those verses. So he arrives at Jerusalem, then you get the triumphal entry, and then what do you make then of the weeping over the city? He's already lamented over it earlier, correct?
In chapter 13, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets.
We had that a couple weeks ago.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in 19, you've got a couple things going on. You talk about, if you only recognize the things that make for peace. Peace is a really important word in Luke's gospel. Then you've got this idea that they're hidden from your eyes. Something is wrong. And there's a way in which the city of Jerusalem is somehow almost fated to miss what's taking place here with Jesus' arrival. Verse 43 seems to be a reference to the siege of Jerusalem in 70. This greatly resembles the way Josephus describes how the city is overwhelmed in verses 43 and 44. But then as well, you did not recognize the time of your visitation from God. It takes us all the way back even to the Benedictus of Zechariah in chapter 1, which uses, and the English translation doesn't get this, uses that same episkopos language, this overseeing visitation kind of language. And the from God is added. It's literally just in Greek, the time of your visitation. The English translators add the from God, which I think is a little suspect. But
heavy-handed?
Yeah, but theologically there's a point here, right? That what's coming. So there's something very prophetic about this, about a prophet weeping over a city and saying, whoa, if only, that kind of language. And then there's going to be consequences to this, which needs to be handled with care, so we're not somehow blaming the rejection of the Messiah, blaming the fall of Jerusalem on the rejection of Jesus or something like that. But
I think it's also worth noting that before the Passion narrative begins, you also have then the destruction of Jerusalem foretold, right, in 21, starting at verse 20. So the way in which Jerusalem, once Jesus arrives in Jerusalem, it's not like immediately the Passion begins. There's this waiting to say what kind of role will the city have, and especially since we've been anticipating this throughout the entirety of Luke.
And this isn't the Sunday to explain this because it's a rather busy Sunday, but for a preacher to think about, the Gospel of Luke tells us a lot about the life of Jesus. The Gospel of Luke also reveals to us a lot about how the life of Jesus is being remembered at the end of the first century. And the Gospel of Luke seems to be very concerned about the loss of Jerusalem and all that means, and so is trying to grapple with. In other words, the death of Jesus looks different from the perspective of this author because the city of Jerusalem has been destroyed in the year 70. And just to kind of talk about, again, maybe just for a preacher to think about the ways in which we view the Passion narrative is always going to be filtered through our own sense of disappointment, hope, frustration, whatever it is where we have sensed God's presence or God's absence or God's blessing or God's judgment. Right? I mean, it's never a neutral story that's told with no contextualization as if the death itself is all that matters, right? The political context or circumstances of it matter just as our current circumstances, whatever those might be, matter for how we hear a story of great violence and justice denied.
Yeah, and I think
that was kind of preachy, lecture-y. Sorry about that.
But I think that's where you mentioned the commentary earlier, Rolf. That's helpful. where Mary Hinkle Shore says that within the Passion story itself, the repeated reminders of the innocence of Jesus draw the eye not so much to atonement, but to the contrast between the corruption that surrounds Jesus and Jesus' own integrity to the end. And I don't want to get ahead of ourselves because I was thinking of that line in conversation with the Philippians text of having the same mind, and so really lifting up that reality of Jesus, of integrity and obedience, and how is it that we are called into that as well. But hopefully we'll get to that. But
I love that part of Mary's commentary too. I mean, it's so hard to write a commentary on this in 1,000 words because you've got this huge text. Just like it's so hard to figure out in a sermon, what am I going to say? Are we going to read this whole thing? How are we going to help this fit with the rest of the liturgy? And Mary's point, I think, is really important, right? People who haven't spent time with this recently, the story of the prosecution against Jesus in Luke's gospel is really confusing. Like, it's just, nobody seems to be acting in their right minds. And that might be part of the point. And I think while Mark especially tells a story of just justice absolutely perverted, in Luke, it's justice just denied. Like, everybody seems to know the right thing to do, but they just don't do it. And that's its own kind of tragedy. You know what I mean? It's a different story than the system was rigged against him in Mark. Here it's like the system just couldn't do what it was supposed to do, so to speak. Or it did exactly what it's supposed to do, which is a couple of powerful people or a small handful of powerful people were able to engineer his death. And his posture, so to speak, that's maybe the wrong word, right? His attitude toward it all, the way he participates in it, in a sense, judges its awfulness by his
fidelity,
just the fact that he continues to kind of emanate salvation even in the midst of this.
And in the words of Mary Hinkle Shore, in faithfulness to the kingdom. I mean, that's, his faithfulness to the kingdom.
True, or just manifest. This is what the kingdom does. The kingdom's going to get railroaded. The kingdom's going to suffer, but the kingdom is going to nevertheless continue to. Or God is, Jesus is. You know what I mean? It's the nature of the kingdom.
Yeah. So I think that any of those areas, I think, could be really a powerful sermon for just to focus on some of those realities of what we've just talked about that brings us to this moment. What does this moment, what does then this moment mean?
Well, especially with the other texts in view. I mean, again, people will read so many texts.
Yep.
Or only people will have to figure out what text they're going to read and focus on. But all of these do capture a mood of injustice and a mood of faithfulness. And the question is, how do you combine those in a meaningful way that makes the death of Jesus authentic to the historical realities, but also then good news, or at least sets the stage for good news to come.
Should we go to Isaiah then with that in mind? Because that's certainly the case, right? You have, this, one of the servant songs, right? What?
This is a bad word, but yes.
I know.
Yeah, the servant songs.
Suffering servant song.
Yeah, it's by the way, in case somebody were wondering why I say that, it's because 19th or 20th century scholarship identified a certain number of passages of Second Isaiah as so-called servant songs, but the servant is mentioned in many other passages within those, and so it's really an artificial thing. What I will say is the key to me is that as the church is trying to figure out, and I shouldn't even say the church, as the followers of Jesus, who are all at first century Jews, are trying to make sense of their experience of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, that these passages in Isaiah, especially this one and the one in chapter 55, 56, really become important as they're trying to, it gives the language, in part because there clearly must have been some sort of analog between the two that starts them down the path, and it really helps them try to figure out what was happening when Jesus, the Son of God, was against all expectation being crucified, and then these texts really then provide a first place, or maybe not first, but the most powerful place of making sense of it, and that's where I think this text is really helpful.
Yeah, 52 and 53
That's
will
what
show
I
up
meant.
again on Good Friday. And there's no, I'm 99.9% sure I'm remembering this correctly. We don't know of any Jewish texts prior to Jesus that are working with those Isaianic passages in a way that suggests this is what the Messiah will do, or this is what, in other words, they're not expecting a future suffering deliverer
Right.
at all. There's not a whole lot of intellectual, theological work being done on those passages. So it's a Christian innovation. Right? It's born out of the experience of what in the world just
Yes.
happened with our Messiah dying on a cross.
Yeah.
That they recognize something in the tradition in their scriptures, which I think is, I think what I hear you saying, Rolf, is that's what we do even now, as we still look for language to describe what makes this good news.
Right.
And a continuing making sense of it as we reproclaim that good news in new contexts.
Right. When people still have experiences like what Isaiah 50 describes here, right? Where there are innocent sufferers,
right,
all around.
And I think going back to our conversation around noting the fidelity of Jesus and his faithfulness to the kingdom, and this is what the kingdom is, then the phrase "setting his face like flint," as the commentary says, carries a sense of unyielding resolution, endurance, and strength. Would you like to add to that, Rolf? Is that? But that's pretty much what it means.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think
he's asking what flint is, because that's
flint.
I hope, because that's my question.
Not to be.
It's a rock.
Is it?
Flint is a rock.
Not to be confused with lint, flint.
The verses 6 and 7, I think you need to go together. First of all, verse 6 says, "I gave my back to those who struck me, and my cheek to those who pull out the beard." So you get this image of shaming, public shaming, somebody ripping out another person's beard, which in the ancient Near East, the dimensions of what that could mean go beyond what we can talk about here. But then I've set my face like flint. So you get those two. I think those two things have to go together. So it's not just the resolution. It's a resolution in the face of persecution and enduring that persecution for the sake. And then, of course, it's shame. I mean, all of this is about shame. And the point of crucifixion, I like to often say, is shaming someone literally to death, so that it then says, it is the Lord who helps me, who will declare me guilty. So I think it really does then help the church understand that suffering a shameful public death is not antithetical to the will of God, but it's actually what the incarnation of God looks like in the midst of a world that's so incredibly fallen.
One of the challenges, I think, with all this is to not make the whole setting your face like flint just a statement of like one's personal strength, but how is this a statement of faith and trust in God, as opposed to this kind of
just being
hyper-masculine virtue or something like that.
Yeah, definitely.
But that's what it's not.
Yeah.
Yes, and I think that's really important, and that's where putting it in part in conversation with Luke, I find helpful in that this is something that Jesus has had in motion for his entire ministry since way back in chapter 9.
I thought you were going to say in Philippians as well, which we'll get to.
Oh yeah, but first the Psalm. It seems like the Psalm is. I mean, what you just said, Rolf, in terms of the verse 9, it is the Lord God who helps me, who would declare me guilty, and the way in which the Psalm kind of fleshes that out in a way.
I think that the Psalm 31 is, I think it's here. I believe that the Psalm in its three parts are spread over the 3 years of the RCL here.
Yes, you're right.
And so the first part is probably why it's here, because Psalm 31:5 says, "Into your hand I commit my spirit," which Jesus, of course, quotes on the cross. It's not just Psalm 22 Jesus quotes, but also Psalm 31. And then this is the middle section, and you're kind of going, what's this here for? But like you said, verse 11 especially, "I am the scorn of my adversaries, a horror to my neighbors." Really, I have passed out of mine like one who is dead. I think it does give a sense of, obviously, of the voice from the cross.
Yeah.
So
I would have
Philippians-
paired this with a different. This seems
Correct.
more appropriate to a mark, to year B, but
Yeah, I agree.
Well, it is, but not.
well,
this year.
I mean, this part of it, right?
Correct.
'Cause,
Yeah, right,
I mean,
right.
When Jesus dies, saying, "Into your hands I commend my spirit." I mean, it's
Right.
a really different death than what we
Right.
see in Mark and Matthew.
Correct.
And that's the point, is that part of the psalm isn't quoted.
Right.
Right.
Right. So
Yeah.
it's kind of odd.
It
but,
is.
Hey.
But there is trust. I mean, again, verses 14, 15, for example, this idea of what does it mean to trust even when you know there's no deliverance
Right.
in a moment.
And even the simple statement that is just so profound in verse 14, "You are my God."
Mm-hmm.
I can have no other God. And so everything that is behind saying, "You are my God," right?
It's actually not even that. I just want to point out, it's, I say, you are my God.
Oh, yeah.
Like it's for emphasis being quoted in direct discourse. Somebody should write a dissertation on that.
Did you
People
write a
are
dissertation
saying.
on that?
That was my dissertation. Many are saying, yes.
You said once you were going to tattoo that on your forearm.
Did I?
You are what? You are
people
my.
are saying.
Many are saying.
Something about many are saying something divine discourse in the Psalms.
I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
you'd have to use a small font.
I haven't read your dissertation lately.
Yeah, lately, exactly.
I need to
Been a few years.
revisit that.
You apparently you don't have trouble falling asleep at night, because that's what dissertations are for.
No, and then I just read my own.
There you go. All right. So, but Philippians, the Christ hymn, which I find it a very helpful text, for just, again, it's sort of anticipating the Passion. This goes with the Passion reading, not with the Palm Sunday reading. But the big translation here question that I want to ask the two of you, and I guess you're probably going to say it's ambiguous. So, but verse 4.
It depends is always my answer.
Yes. I'm sorry. I didn't mean verse 4. I meant verse 6. So it says, "Let the same mind be among you that was in Christ Jesus." And then the NRSV or NRSView says, "Who, though he existed in the form of God," and the "though" is either implied, hence NRSV, or it's wrong. And that is because it could just be translated, "who, being in the form of God, did not regard." So it's not like sort of, it's
not concessive.
Yes.
Yeah.
This really is not, I think the "though" kind of says, well, it's not really who God is to suffer and die.
I see what you mean.
And I actually like the sort of thing that says, no, because this is the form of God, which is, I think, what the church's witness is.
Yeah.
Matt's got the Greek in front of him. I don't.
It is ambiguous.
I didn't
correct.
bring my.
It is. It's just, it could be because, it could be although, it could be since.
Yeah.
Since is good. Since kind of gets at what you're trying to say, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the answer is, how do you know? And then the answer is, well, the question is, how do you know? And the answer is context. And you look at the context and you're like, well, it could be either. And so then it's like, well, what's your favorite theology? And then you hope you get the votes in the translation committee meeting. But it's good to focus on that, right? Because, I mean, what you're saying is God goes against God's nature, or this is who God has always been, right?
Yeah.
Who doesn't grasp after power. And I think it's a good question for a preacher to mull over, but then to talk about what does it mean to snatch, to seize?
I was going to say, what does it mean to sneeze?
To grab power. Who does that? What kind of God does that? And what kind of God does not?
Sermon Brainwave is a production of Luther Seminary's Working Preacher. Working Preacher has been a trusted source of inspiration, interpretation, and imagination for preachers worldwide since 2007. Find episodes and links at workingpreacher.org/brainwave, and be sure to rate, subscribe, and comment on YouTube. Thanks for joining us.